G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here, and I'm here to talk to you about economies of scale. It's quite amazing some of the fanciful ideas that people have about this rather simple basic concept of economics, and I'm here to dispel some of the myths and outline some of the facts. So what are economies of scale? It's simply the concept that as output increases, this is the output axis here, we generally expect that some functions, the average total cost of producing them, will decrease. So this here, this part of the curve, is all economies of scale. As the output's going towards the right, the average total costs are going towards the south. That's economies of scale. Now, I can only assume that I and everyone else that gives these lectures is extremely boring, because it seems to be that every public policy architect has heard that first phrase and then switched off and not listened to everything else that I'm about to say. So if you found yourself falling asleep, can you please wake up now? Okay, now what's expected is only some functions will have these economies of scale. After the economies of scale become fully exhausted, we expect a rather flat and long period of constant return to the scale. Now what's happening here during this constant return to the scale is as output increases, there's no change to average total cost at all. Now, the next bit to listen to that no one seems to ever listen to, certainly not our public policy architects, certainly not the people working for these commercial consulting firms, is that if we push this even further, neoclassical economists predict that we'll start to reap what's referred to as diseconomies of scale, whereby as the output increases more, the costs are actually heading north. The average total costs are increasing. That's diseconomies of scale. So just to recap, because this is something that so many commercial consultants get screwed up, let's get the point straight. First, not all functions are associated with economies of scale. Second, if they are, eventually those economies of scale will be exhausted. Third, after that point, we'll then go into an extensive domain of constant returns to scale where there's no savings at all as you increase output. And fourth, and most importantly, if you push it even further, you eventually get diseconomies of scale and costs increase as output increases. Now, this economies of scale idea was actually outlined by Adam Smith in his 1776 work, The Wealth of Nations. I believe it's 1776, it might have been 1784, but sometime around then. And he gives the example of a factory making haberdashery pins, and he was quite taken with how much could happen when people specialized, how much more production could be done with the same resources by specializing in particular activities. Now, I've never made a haberdashery pin, like a pin that you pin cloth together with, but apparently you've got to cut the wire, then you sharpen one end, and then you solder a head onto it, etc., etc. And he reckons that one person by themselves be flat out making 20, but he says that if you specialize those tasks, have one person cutting wire all day, another person sharpening heads all day, another person making the ends and soldering them on all day, that you could have a, now wait for it, 240-fold increase on a per person basis through specialization. Truly, it must have been a miracle in the production of haberdashery pins. I doubt the validity of what he says, but if anyone makes haberdashery pins as a hobby, please let me know. If you think that specializing could allow you to produce 240 times more pins in a day, please let me know. I might be wrong. I might stand corrected on this. Now, the principal reason we capture these economies of scale, certainly what was outlined by Smith, was specialization. Unfortunately, not every task can be sensibly specialized. You think about the ranger that captures nuisance dogs and nuisance cats and things like that. Can you specialize that activity? Can you have one person to drive the car, another person to go and capture the animal, another person to put the animal in the boot of the car, another person to fill in the paperwork, another person to take it back to the council chamber. No, it wouldn't make sense, would it, to specialise that? Some functions can be specialised, some functions can't. And that's why economies of scale don't exist for every function. Now, the more complicated services, the people-orientated things, aren't going to be amenable to economies of scale. All that's going to happen is when you increase the output by amalgamating councils or making councils bigger, all that's going to happen is you've got to put on more staff. There's not going to be a significant decrease in average total cost. One of the big reasons why we do have economies of scale is better use of excess capacity. So if you've got plant and equipment that could be used for more purposes, by amalgamating councils, it could be possible that you could use up the excess capacity that was going to waste previously. And it's often claimed that economies of scale are somehow linked to greater purchasing power. If you make councils bigger by amalgamating councils, all of a sudden they're purchasing more, they can get a better deal. Well, if that was actually the truth, then you'd go to statewide procurement, which they've done in some states, but the evidence actually suggests it ends up costing more. So who knows? But they're the main sources of economies of scale. But as I said, it's not a magic pudding. You just don't keep making these councils bigger and bigger and bigger and reap economies of scale forevermore. If that was the case, let's amalgamate the 537 councils in Australia, make one Council of Australia, and we can all pay next to no taxes and drive around on gold-plated roads and be incredibly happy. Shoot, why don't we just amalgamate all the local governments in the whole entire world if these economies of scale exist forever and just have one local government for the whole world, and we'll be even better off. It's what logicians call reductio ad absurdum. If you take it to the final legs of this argument, you get an absurd result, and that's exactly what's happened. But just about every amalgamation episode in Australia, at least, has revolved around these economies of scale, all been about economies of scale. No one's actually bothered to measure them. No one's mentioned constant returns of scale. No one's mentioned the fact that the economies of scale don't exist for all functions, that they're functionally specific. And no one ever mentions diseconomies of scale. And this is why we keep ending up in disaster. And as I say, I take responsibility. Clearly, I'm a very boring person, and clearly is every other Econ 101 lecturer, because it seems like all the commercial consultants, all the public policy architects have only ever heard that first sentence in the first lecture about economies of scale. But why did diseconomies happen? Less transparency, and that's a big issue. Bigger organisations, people can fly under the radar. They don't get noticed when they're not pulling their weight. It doesn't seem like such a big deal to put on an extra staff member when you're running a council with 1,000 staff members compared to if you're running a council with 50 staff members. And it's that lack of transparency that makes all the difference. Plus, you end up with more middle management. It inevitably happens in bigger organisations. So not only do you end up with more middle management, but the middle management get remunerated at a higher rate. They have more staff. It's not unreasonable. They want to be paid more. And a lot of councils use a remuneration one software system that predicts how much people should be paid based on the number of staff they supervise, the activities, etc. And almost inevitably after amalgamation, wages go up. Because people have increased responsibility. We also find that in larger organisations it's harder to coordinate people. It's harder to get everyone working on the same page with the same objective, particularly when you're trying to do cultural change or you're trying to address a fiscal crisis and get everyone on board with a new program. Really hard to do in larger organisations. And there is in the literature, no one likes talking about it, but it's true that in larger organisations, often people take unwarranted perquisites that they mightn't do so in smaller organisations. For instance, driving the work car home when it's not part of your salary package, things like that. Not major issues, just small issues, but they all add up over time. So diseconomies of scale are a real problem, and we've got to be awake to it, or we're just going to keep having these disasters. But there's another problem, and that is that most functions have optimal scales that are different sizes. So look at function A here, the flat part of the curve, the optimal scale is at 20,000. Function B, optimal size is at 5,000. Function D, optimal size, the flat part of the curve, is at 50,000. Well, what do you amalgamate to? Do you amalgamate the council so you get to the size of 50,000? If you do, you'll get the cheapest unit cost for that particular function, function D, but you'll notice at 50,000, you're in the diseconomies range for function B, and you're well into the diseconomies range for function A. What's even more interesting is that function C, which is in fact most of the functions, there was a study done by Fay et al. A few years ago that looked at this on a functional basis, and most functions are like this. The function doesn't even have economies of scale, so by increasing output, you've achieved nothing anyway. But the biggest problem is with amalgamation is that you only go to one size. You'll end up with a certain number of people and a certain number of properties, and yet all your functions have economies of scale fully exhausted at different sizes, and that's why amalgamation is not necessarily the best answer. I'll do a video later on shared services that's often put up as a counter proposal to amalgamation, and it allows you to mix and match your partners so you'll always get close to optimal scale for each function that is amenable to economies of scale. Now, the question is, can you measure them? Well, yes, you can, quite precisely. There's quite a lot of different techniques to do it. The obvious easy way is econometrics, it's multiple regression analysis. You have your regressand is unit cost, so cost per property in Australia, or cost per person if you're in a place where local government does a lot for people-directed services. And against that, you put all the typical regressors associated with costs, and you can work out from there what the optimal scale is likely to be. Best done on a panel of data over many years so you get nice robust results. There's another technique called data envelopment analysis, and that can give you precise readings for the optimal scale for a particular council. That can also be done in a intertemporal manner. It's a little bit more complex, but that's also bread and butter for people like me, economists, empirical economists. So it's something that's really, really doable, but sadly, it's something that hasn't been done in at least the last 3 forced amalgamation episodes in Australia. So we shouldn't be surprised that the last 3 forced amalgamation episodes in Australia have ended up in de-amalgamations. Well, New South Wales hasn't had de-amalgamations yet, but it's almost inevitable because people aren't doing their homework. This is doable for people that know how to do it, but we keep employing and appointing so-called experts to independent panels that don't have the expertise to do these things. Basic things that have to be done to have a hope of coming out with the outcomes that you want. It's just, it makes me so cranky. It's almost criminally negligent when you think about the damage that's been done to people's lives, the chaos and the suffering that the communities experience because people didn't do their homework, things that could have been done. And in the case of New South Wales, prior to the amalgamation, I and other scholars were doing this and giving out these warnings, yet the experts in charge of the deal weren't doing this, but were confidently proclaiming that we were going to save billions of dollars over 20 years, which has never eventuated, as we've seen. If you haven't seen that, please watch my other videos. So it is possible to measure these things. So in summary, what I want you to understand is this. The economies of scale exist for some functions, not all functions. When they do exist, it's only going to happen over a short domain. Most of it's going to be constant returns of scale, and if we're silly enough to get too big, we'll get diseconomies of scale. We also need to remember the economies of scale are likely to be specific for each function, and that the problem with that is that you'll have different optimal sizes for different functions, and then the question is, well, if you amalgamate, you only get one size. Which size do you aim for? And finally, we need to remember that these things can be measured quite precisely. It's just a matter of doing our homework, and we can avoid problems. We can avoid suffering. We can avoid stuff-ups, and ultimately we can avoid the amalgamations, because that's what happens when you get the amalgamations wrong. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.